Hi guys, and welcome to the guide. In this episode we are talking about the Japanese Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, and Hien translates from Japanese to English as swallow. So the Ki-61 Swallow. And this plane's freaking awesome. Alright, if I was a Japanese fighter pilot during World War II, and I had the choice between flying the Zero, the most famous of the two, or the Ki-61, I'd fly the Ki-61 in a heartbeat. I really would. I'd be like, yeah, fuck the Zero. I'm going with the Ki-61. It was a land-based fighter, so it was relegated to airstrips on the islands, Japanese-occupied islands. So the Zero had that up on it, where the Zero could operate off of carriers. So yeah, the Zero had that up on it. But otherwise, overall performance, the Hien, the Ki-61, like completely and totally kicks the Zero's ass, if you ask me. The Allied codename for it was Tony, and it was the only Japanese fighter that I'm aware of that used a liquid-cooled engine. And where the Japanese got that liquid-cooled engine was from the Germans. It actually uses the same engine as a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The Daimler-Benz DB610A. The Japanese got the license and the rights to produce it locally, the engine locally, because they were watching events in Europe and realizing that inline liquid-cooled engines were the way to go for the future. So that's what they did. They went over, talked to the Germans, and was like, hey, can we get the rights to produce your freaking awesome engine? And the Germans were like, yeah, sure, I guess so. Technically, you're our allies. So yeah, that's how the Japanese got their hands on the engine that powered the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the pretty much most famous fighter that the Germans had throughout the war. So the Japanese got the rights to locally produce the Daimler-Benz DB610A engine, and they called it the Kawasaki HA40. So that's what they called their new engine that wasn't really theirs, but you know, who cared, because it was a freaking awesome engine. And they turned around and they used that engine to create the Ki-61, which turned out to be a pretty freaking awesome plane in its own right. Alright, to the specs. It had a wingspan of 39 feet and a length of 29 feet. Was powered again by the Kawasaki HA40 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine that produced 1,175 horsepower. It could reach a top speed of 367 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. But if you put this thing into a dive, like, it would haul ass in a dive. So yeah, there's that. It had a range of 683 miles and could reach its ceiling. The highest it could go was 38,000 feet. It was armed with 4 machine guns. The first versions that were made had 250 cals and then 230 cals, and then later versions had 450 cals. And then the versions towards the end of the war, whenever we were like bombing the shit out of Japan and making all those firestorms and pretty much decimating the country of Japan, they strapped on cannons on this thing, but that kind of killed the maneuverability of it because the cannons were too heavy for it. So the original idea for the Ki-61 came in 1941 when Kawasaki, yeah, that's right, Kawasaki, the company that makes Kawasaki Ninja motorcycles, made freaking fighter airplanes in World War II. Like, how's that for street cred? But anyways, the original idea for the Ki-61 came in 1941 when Kawasaki got their assembly line up and running for the German Daimler-Benz DB610A engine. So, but the Japanese needed a fighter to stick this engine into. They're like, this is an awesome engine, but we need an airframe to stick this engine on. So that's where the Ki-61 came in. It's a completely and totally original Japanese airframe, even though, like, when it first showed up, the Allied pilots who had to face it, they thought it was either a German-built airplane, they thought it was a Messerschmitt Bf-109, or maybe an Italian airplane. Like, they didn't think it was a Japanese home-built airplane, but it was, because they were just like, god damn, this airplane's awesome. This can't be Japanese, because we were a bunch of racist assholes in World War II. But anyways, the first flight of it came in December 1941. And they did intense evaluations throughout 1942 on this plane. Instead of like sending it straight to the front line, they're like, we're gonna test this plane, because Japanese are like that, where they just test everything. Anyways, it could have done a lot of good in 1942. If they would just been like, fuck it, send it to the front line, it would have done a lot of good. But instead, they tested the crap out of it. They tested it against a German Bf-109 Messerschmitt, an E model, a locally built Nakajima Ki-43, and also a Nakajima Ki-44. And they even tested it against American P-40 Warhawk. And it turned out to be the best of all the planes. Like, performance-wise, everything-wise, it turned out to be the best of all planes. It wasn't quite as maneuverable as the Ki-43, but like, the Ki-43 is insanely maneuverable, but the Ki-43 is too slow, so that's the downside of the Ki-43. And it began production on August of 1942. That's when they finally started producing these things. It got to the first combat units, Japanese combat units, in February 1943. That's the first time they started officially showing up in combat. But supposedly during the Doolittle raid, some of the prototypes took off and tried to shoot down some of the American B-25 bombers that like crossed over Japan. Supposedly. That's what Wikipedia said anyways. I mean, I'm going off of two sources here. I'm going off of a book and I'm going off of Wikipedia. So what do you want? Alright, so whenever this thing showed up over the skies of the Pacific in 1943, the Allied pilots who had to face it pretty much hated its guts. They named it the Japanese Mustang because it kind of resembles the P-51 Mustang. And it handles really good. It handled really good. And it had pretty good armament for a Japanese fighter, especially the ones that had the 450 caliber machine guns. And for some reason, at least according to this game, Japanese 50 caliber machine guns are more powerful than American 50 caliber machine guns. For some reason, according to this game, that's what it seems to be. But as far as armament goes for Japanese aircraft, 450 caliber machine guns is pretty damn good. And also, unlike other Japanese airplanes, like, this plane actually had protection. Like, Japanese actually put some emphasis on protecting the pilot and giving the plane some ruggedness so it could take hits. Because most Japanese airplanes, the Zero included, you hit it in the right spot a couple of times and it's just bursting into flames. This plane was not like that. It could actually take some hits and keep on chugging along. And also, it could dive like a motherfucker. Like, the tactics that Americans were used to using in World War II against Japanese fighters was if the Japanese fighter had an advantage over the American, they would just dive and then zoom away. And the Japanese aircraft, they could climb really well, but they were built light, and that meant that they couldn't dive very well. American pilots could not dive away from the Ki-61 Hien. Like, it would keep up, and it could even pass American aircraft. So, that was a shocker. Americans really hated that. Like, their one go-to option to get out of jail free card just got taken away from them, and they were not very happy about that. But the Ki-61 was never really built in big enough numbers to, like, do too big of a dent against the Allied push into the Pacific. According to the book, 2,753 of them were built, and according to Wikipedia, just over 3,000 of them were built. So, unfortunately, there just wasn't enough of the Ki-61s to really make a big dent in the Allied Pacific War, like against the Allies in the Pacific War. There just wasn't enough of them. And they were land-based. So, in the Pacific, which is pretty much all ocean, they could only operate off of island air bases. So that was kind of a damper. And to add upon that, the Daimler-Benz engine that they inherited from the Germans was kind of finicky in the tropics. The engine was built and made to operate in Europe's climate, and whenever they brought the engine over in the tropics of the Pacific climate, it had tuning problems, and it just turned out to be a really finicky engine that Kawasaki could never fix. So they lost a lot of Ki-61s just on stupid shit, like just transporting them from one island to another island, and planes had engine problems and they end up ditching in the sea. So that was a big downside to this plane. It had excellent performance, but its engine was always kind of screwing it over. But if they could have fixed the engine problem, and if they could have made enough of these things in enough numbers, it could have made a pretty good dent in the American war effort. It really could have. Alright, thanks for watching.